Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Chinese ambassador to Israel, Du Wei, was found dead in his residence last week, and while there was seemingly no foul play involved, the timing was curious. Ambassador Du only arrived in Israel about 3 months ago at the height of the corona contagion's outbreak in his country, and his death came merely a couple of days after a visit to Jerusalem by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, whose purpose was partially to urge Israel to avoid trade arrangements with Beijing, which could threaten American national security. What are China's interests and ambitions in the Middle East, and how does Israel maneuver between these global giants? To analyze this question, we're joined from another location here in Jerusalem by Mr. Robert Silverman, who is a lecturer at Shalem College and former president of the American Foreign Service Association. Welcome.
Thank you.
Also joining our panel from Central Israel is Colonel in Reserve Reuven Ben-Shalom, who is a cross-cultural strategist and associate at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism in Herzliya. Welcome.
Shalom.
And also joining me here in the studio is our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir, Oren. I would like to immediately dive into this topic. Mr. Oren, China has been involved, of course, in promoting its Road and Belt Initiative, among other significant projects that it's trying to promote among Israel and Arab states as well. It has been very active in asserting a footprint with all that is related to combating the corona contagion, assisting countries that are really struggling both economically as well as socially, including Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt also, of course, but really, it is growing and growing, pertaining to a certain level that the Americans are starting now also to ask questions of whether they shouldn't put a certain block of those aspirations. We saw the top American diplomat, as I mentioned in the introduction, coming to Jerusalem and talking about this with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Tell us more about this specifically, but also in general. How is China really asserting its dominance?
So there is a difference between the nation of China and the Chinese regime and the individual Chinese. China, of course, is an economic powerhouse, second only to the United States, and perhaps is going to overcome the American economy. But the individual Chinese is very poor. Just to give you an example, the Israeli gross domestic product per capita is about $40,000 annually, more than that, $41,000. The Chinese one is $4,000, 1/10 of the Israeli GDP per capita, which is one reason you see so many Chinese workers here on infrastructure projects. Now, if you move to the United States, this is both a national security issue and a domestic issue in politics. Now, we fortunately have Bob Silverman here with us. Many of his predecessors in the U.S. Foreign Service were blamed 70 years ago for losing China, quote unquote, as if China was the United States to lose or to have. This was part of the McCarthy era and the hysteria of the Cold War, the early years. But right now, President Trump is trying to build a case where, first of all, China was not transparent enough when the COVID-19 contagion started and did not disclose what has happened in the Wuhan province early enough. And also, he is blaming the Chinese Communist Party for controlling many technological and other corporations, and therefore he has barred the Huawei firm from entering the U.S. market, and especially national and defense-related entities. Also, Taiwan has just invested $12 billion in a semiconductor plant in Arizona, and China has blocked Taiwan from entering the World Health Organization. And Secretary Pompeo came to Israel to warn Israel away from being engaged too much in certain projects, such as the desalinization plant at Sorek. So Israel is between a rock and a hard place here. It has to manage its affairs very carefully.
Indeed. I'd like to move to you, Mr. Silverman.
Sure.
China has been involved in foreign direct investment vis-a-vis Israel for quite some time now. It's purchased and is investing also a lot in the whole aspect of maritime shipping in the Israeli ports, and is trying also to advance its infrastructure in other sectors within Israel, something that just several years ago we had the former national security advisor of the United States come to Israel, Mr. John Bolton, stressing to Israel and warning Israel that if it would continue doing so, there might be consequences to the security coordination between Washington and Jerusalem and all that pertains to intelligence and other elements that are also, to a certain degree, very much needing this infrastructure in order to keep an open line. To what degree do you see the current situation in which Israel is interested in Chinese business? It is interested in maintaining good relations with Beijing, which is obviously a superpower. Israel is a small country that still needs to maneuver in between the global powers, and at the same time is openly saying that the United States is its closest ally. It is also quite evident on the ground that the United States and Israel are very close in not just one field on security, but in all sectors of its economy and social construct. How do you see this actually evolving to a certain degree?
Thank you, Jonathan and Amir. I am a hawk when it comes to relations with China, meaning I'm very skeptical of China, and let me give two main reasons. And I agree completely with Amir that we're talking now about the Chinese government. That's the concern. It's not individual Chinese people. The concern is the nature of the Chinese government, number one. And number two, it's the Chinese-Iranian relationship that we all have to keep in mind and how important that is in the regional strategy of China. So, look, the Chinese government does not operate like a normal player in the world. And the U.S. has learned this over the course of decades. You know, we came at the relationship with China in the hopes that by working with China, by sponsoring its membership in the World Trade Organization and that it would normalize and become a normal player. It has not become a normal player. And let me give you several examples. Whenever you're doing business with a Chinese company, whether it's a state company or private company, you always have to keep in mind that you're actually dealing with the Chinese government, because the Chinese government controls all the private companies and the state companies. One concrete example, Israel and the United States and European countries, it's illegal in those countries to engage in bribery or corruption. In China, it is not illegal to bribe foreign players. It is, in fact, the way they do business. And we've seen this even in Israel. There were allegations. The largest Chinese investment in Israel is, of course, its acquisition of a controlling interest in Tnuva, Israel's largest food company. And at the time of that investment in 2014, there were a lot of press allegations that there was bribery involved. None of that was completely proven, but there were such allegations. And there are many, many cases that, again, this is not illegal in China to do it. And unlike the United States, unlike Israel. So the corruption angle is always going to be there when you're dealing with China. And it's just the way they do business. Technology stealing is another problem, a huge problem. This is going to be an enormous problem for the desalination. Israel has great technology in desalination. And China has proven time and again that it doesn't honor agreements on intellectual property protection. It steals that technology. It feels that that's the way to do business. And so I guarantee you that if Israel does a deal with to build a desalination plant built by the Chinese, Israel's technology will suddenly become available not just to that one company that's doing the construction, but to all other Chinese companies via the Chinese government. So they steal technology. Let me
Which
just
raises
finally...
my question.
Yes.
It raises a question, and I'd like actually to refer this question to Colonel Ben-Shalom.
Yes.
In the Second Amendment of the Chinese Communist Party's constitution for China, it says that any corporation or any business, private or not private, will be subject to service of the central government in China, something that obviously raises a lot of questions and somewhat ratifies what Mr. Silverman is saying about the government's involvement. To what degree does this not concern the Israelis? And on the other hand, what are the assurances that China usually gives to Israel pertaining to security-related issues and others?
As far as security-related issues, I don't think we do with them sensitive collaboration on such matters. Remember that we are under very strict guidelines by our American partners, and Israel adheres to this very carefully. Remember that when we tried to go around that, or when we weren't not abiding by these, like with the Falcon deal and the Harpy, then this was a very big strain on our relationship with the United States. So today we actually do not do any significant security-related issues, and all our collaboration with the Chinese is what I would call soft issues. And by the way, water desalination would be one of them. That goes into the realm of espionage, but not militarily or intelligence, but trade secrets. So I would take the military aspect and security-sensitive aspect off the table because we work very closely with the United States. I think when we deal with this entire issue, we have to remember that we are a small country, aligned with the United States 100%. I meet business investors from China almost every month. And they ask me about this, and I have to look them in the eye and tell them, I appreciate you very much. We're good friends. You and us, we go back thousands of years, unlike the Americans that are new on the block. But Israel is aligned strategically with the United States, and this is very important for Israel's cooperation and Israel's stance in the world. Notice also that the terminology that we use with the United States, which is strategic in nature, we don't use the word even strategy with the Chinese. It's partnerships, okay, innovation partnerships and things like that. And this is very important for us to shape it and keep it where it is in order to maintain our main strategic ally, which is the United States.
Mr. Oren?
If you go back and look at documents in Israel's National Archive, you go back to the early 50s, you find similar problems between Jerusalem and Washington vis-a-vis China, because the Israeli Foreign Ministry at the time tried to get on the better side of the non-aligned movement. And Foreign Minister Sharet, mostly, who for a couple of years was also Prime Minister, wanted to help the Chinese, the communist Chinese, at the expense of what was then called Formosa, Taiwan. And the Americans intervened and pushed Israel very hard to vote in the United Nations against seating China, Beijing, or Peking, as it was called at the time, in the Security Council and the UN itself, rather than Taipei, Taiwan. Now, Israel has this problem of maneuvering between the two because there are two time frames involved. The Chinese always look ahead 20, 30 years from now. They have programs looking at 2040, 2050. They do not rush things. However, their program, you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, their program is very structured. The American program is at loggerheads with the Chinese program because the Americans have tried to pivot from the Middle East to the Far East. They want to take their forces out of Iraq, Syria, perhaps Sinai, the MFO, and position them so that if China tries to get over the South China Sea by having artificial islands there, island hopping, saying that this is Chinese territory, they will be positioned in various places around it. So the Chinese have counter-enveloped the United States by moving into the Middle East. This is like an ancient game where one party tries to encircle the other from the left, and the other one comes back and encircles from the right. And Israel finds itself in a very awkward position because it doesn't want to anger any of the giants.
Mr. Silverman, to what degree do you see the current situation in which China has also been heavily investing also in the Egyptians to the west of Israel and to the north of Israel, countries that have less friendly relations with Israel, to say the least? But when we're speaking specifically about Egypt, the United States has been talking about possibly disengagement from the Sinai Peninsula, while at the same time, we hear the Egyptian ambassador to China praising the central government in Beijing for the assistance that it granted Cairo in combating the coronavirus, in providing all kind of protective gear for the Egyptian medical staff and really dealing with this contagion spread. Is this now not going to evolve into something new where, as Mr. Oren is stating, this is not a regional game, this is a global game? We need to zoom out and understand all the different components pertaining to this specific cold conflict, if you will, between Beijing and Washington, and to what degree is Washington invested in thwarting China from really taking an even larger foothold within Israel at a time like this?
Thank you. I agree with you, Jonathan. It's time to be very strategic in any dealings with China because, again, they're not a normal player, and they are looking very strategically at every interaction within countries like Egypt and Israel. You know, Israel may see it as a commercial opportunity, and that's completely understandable, but China does not relate to it that way. They see all these transactions in a very strategic way. And, you know, their investments, it's not a surprise that their first very large investment in Israel was in a food company because they go around the world investing in raw materials and food companies. That's what they do to ensure supplies to their own population. And their largest investment in the U.S. is in Hormel, which is the largest producer of pork in the U.S. And they've tied up a lot of the pork production in the U.S. in exports to China at a time that now turns out that there's a meat shortage. So you have to look at every transaction with China in a way, in a very strategic way, just as you suggested, Jonathan. And they don't respect differences between civilian and military. Let me give you a concrete example. So you may think you're doing a strict commercial deal with China, but that's not the way that China is dealing with it. And an example is how in the South China Seas, as Oren mentioned, there are all kinds of islands that the Chinese have built. And also, they have commercial shipping vessels all over the South China Sea. Those commercial shipping vessels are being used to block U.S. naval maneuvers. So they may look like private little shipper fishing vessels, but they're being operated through the direction of the Chinese government to block U.S. naval ships. And U.S. naval ships have had to warn the fishing vessels of China that they will fire on them because they're being used very aggressively by the Chinese government. So again, China is not a normal player. Their biggest partner right now in the Middle East is Iran. The largest investor in Iran is China because Iran is off limits to most other countries, but China doesn't observe the rules. So China sees Iran as a treasure trove because they're the only player there. So they're going around investing all over Iran, and they will transfer, and they have transferred technology. There's a lot of intelligence about this to Iran. So if you want to do business with China, you are also endangering your own country's security in all kinds of ways because that technology will be transferred to Iran. You know, we know how Pakistan and North Korea got nuclear weapons. That was with Chinese support. So I think we have to be very careful in any transaction with Iran for all of those reasons.
Colonel Ben-Shalom, I'd like to hear your response to Silverman's comments. To what degree is Israel concerned that any business done with China may indeed fall into the hands of Iran, considering the fact that ultimately the Islamic Republic is still openly calling for Israel's destruction? Whether it's capable of doing so or not is a different story. But I'd like to ask also in particular, the Chinese are openly saying that the United States is right now embroiled in rhetoric against the Beijing government with regard to its global interests. And because they're not aligned, they're saying that the United States is establishing a global propaganda campaign to try and dissuade other countries from involving themselves. To what degree is Israel really able to maneuver between what truly is to what is said?
Well, first, I think you see I'm trying to be diplomatic, and I think Robert is not trying to be diplomatic. And I agree with many of the things that you say, Robert, but the word normal strikes me, as someone that deals with culture. With culture, there is no normal. So it's not like we, in our Western eyes, say, we and the Americans, we're normal. They're not normal. They're normal for them. They are who they are. It's certainly very important to understand their culture, and I don't think we understand it enough. And I don't think we understand the historic perspective, and I don't think most of us even understand their current policy. I think 9 out of 10 people in the street, you ask them, what is the Belt and Road Initiative? They'll say they have no idea what it is. I'm serious. So here they're saying what they're doing, right, for years. They say what they're going to do, and then they go and do it all over the world, and especially all around the Middle East. And we're just not opening our eyes to see that. So I think this is very important to understand. I think it's critical for us not to use the regular terminology that is Middle Eastern and Western terminology of good guys, bad guys. So we're the good guys, of course, and they're the bad guys. Not only that, they are aligned with Iran, and Iran are certainly the bad guys, right? The Chinese mentality, of course, is to engage bilaterally with all the partners and promote their interests to the best of their possibilities. They play the game on the table. They play Go, we play chess. And I think this is the way they do business. And in a way, I respect that. And I think we should do the same. So I certainly object to going as far as the Americans go, as talking about Iran as a rival, period, or an enemy almost. Notice how the American rhetoric has been changing recently, almost an enemy, or a future. China is almost an enemy. My friends in the U.S. Air Force are imagining dogfights with Chinese warplanes. So I think we have to be more Chinese here. We have to understand our place in the region, play this game in a very calculated way, be diplomatic. Remember the Chinese. For them, it's very important not to lose face, which is also part of what I'm doing here, because next week I meet Chinese investors when they come back after COVID. And certainly we have to understand all these downsides, understand them very well, and play it very carefully. We have a lot to lose strategically, especially with the great investment and involvements they have now with Israeli infrastructure, exposure to strategic data. And so I'm very concerned, which is why I think we have to have important guidelines. The advisory committee that we stood up, I think, is very important. We should look very carefully at every involvement, every investment, and certainly make sure that strategic assets that can endanger Israel and endanger our strategic partners should be checked.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a short analysis for the near future. Mr. Oren, we'll start with you.
The coronavirus crisis was obviously first and foremost a humanitarian disaster. Hundreds of thousands dead. The end is not in sight. But for China, it was also a public relations disaster. And this ties in with what Reuven just said. So it was very important for them to help not only Egypt, as you mentioned, but also Israel, the United States, and other countries around the world by sending equipment, donating, sending some of their expertise, and so on and so forth. One of the last things that the late Ambassador Du Wei managed to say to an Israeli audience is that Jews of all people should beware of conspiracy theories. They know what it is to be blamed for the trouble that the world is undergoing, and the Chinese feel their affinity with this problem.
Well, indeed, they do know how to trigger the feelings of Israelis. Colonel Ben-Shalom?
I don't know much about finances, but I think they're going to exploit the situation now. Again, they're very strategic, very long-term vision. I think they're going to look at the situation now, and as investors that want to be involved more in strategic projects in the Middle East, they're going to go now to entities that have a problem with the financial situation, which means we're going to be more challenged in this realm.
Mr. Silverman?
Thank you. I do want to emphasize when I say that China is not normal, it does not operate by the international rules that we all have agreed upon. And for instance, it does not disclose, when it does infrastructure construction projects in other countries, it does not disclose the terms of those deals with the IMF, unlike other countries. That's just one example. Because there's often more than one agenda going on in those infrastructure projects. You just have to look at what they have, their record on this Belt and Road project in other countries. Sri Lanka is an example. They use infrastructure loans as a way to gain leverage in these countries. And then for smaller countries, and Israel is a smaller country, they can use those infrastructure loans to dictate other terms. And so this is the way they operate.
Unfortunately, we will have to revisit this topic in the near future as we ran out of time. I'd like to thank Colonel Ben-Shalom, Mr. Silverman, as well as Mr. Oren for being with us today.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.